Welcome to another episode of Breaking Into Cybersecurity CISO Thursdays. And for all of you joining us on LinkedIn, thank you for joining us. Make sure that you follow myself and our guest. If you're joining us on YouTube, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and then hit the notification button so that the next time we come live, it'll pop up on your screen. And for those of you joining us on podcast, don't forget to share it with your friends and families. Thank you. So today, our guest, uh, I always mess it up. Ashnu, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Anshu Gupta. I'm a cybersecurity practitioner. Been in the industry for a long time, started my career in the Big Four at Ernst& Young and KPMG, and then moved on to the startup world where I established security programs at companies including Coupa, HelloSign, Varo Bank, and recently at Fast. I'm also part of a global syndicate of global CISOs called Silicon Valley CISO Investors. And thank you for inviting the show. Glad to be part of it.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to touch on that interesting part there. I didn't know you were part of the CISO syndicate. In regards to that, what does a CISO look for when they're looking to invest in a potential startup company?
So I think one uh, idea which came, the reason I think this VCI came about to be, is that practitioners have the best idea as to what does the industry need. And typically, investors will do their own due diligence and they look at the team, they go to market. And we as practitioners basically are extremely well suited to do this due diligence apart from. So there's a little bit of complementary skill set where how do you establish a SPV to do the investments and so on. But from a due diligence and even from shaping, because many times if you especially invest in early stage companies,
Mhm.
might not have the exact product market fit, and you can help them prioritize features, you can guide them in the right direction, you can help them avoid big mistakes, you can introduce them to the right stakeholders, help them as design partners and so on. So there's a lot of value add that practitioners can bring, apart from being a purely investment vehicle.
And I know you've had expertise in the startup space, so I'm going to kind of stay there in regards to our questioning. What what should a startup look for in potentially its first or second security hire for those individuals that are looking to break into the field and potentially work in a startup as their first security hire?
Absolutely. So I think you bring a very interesting question that startups, when in initial phase, they need someone who is a bit hands-on and can take on some of the technical challenges as they come along. And especially when you're building the product, security engineering is one of the most important functions where uh, is our backend secure? Is our application secure? Are we introducing the right security features at the product customer facing feature functionality level? So I would say that it's a different skill set as compared to when you're more mature, you have a larger team, and some of the skills are more around people management. That how do you keep the team engaged? How do you keep the team motivated? There are a lot more external stakeholders. Like if you go public as the company grows. But in the initial stages, you do need someone who can roll their sleeves up, um, and be
Okay.
more
So
technical as required.
would you say that the first security hires might be more on the application security side, the infrastructure security side, or they actually need to have a little bit of everything?
So I think there are two different approaches. One is what I call a top-down approach, and one is bottoms-up approach. And basically, they're depending on the risk appetite and what the company is trying to accomplish. So one approach, the top-down approach, is that you hire a leader who has been there, done that, has made those mistakes, is fairly experienced,
Mhm.
and then you bring these specific functions of compliance, application security, and cloud or infrastructure security. So I tell people that if you want to do security seriously, even in an early stage, you actually need a 4-person MVP team where you have one leader who's been there, done that, has handled all the security domains of GRC, security engineering, security operations, corporate IT security, and privacy engineering.
Mhm.
And then you have at least 3 people, like one person to handle the GRC function, one application security engineer, and one cloud security engineer.
And what stage of a startup would they have a four-person security team versus, say, a one-person security team?
Yeah. So again, it depends on like how much funding do you have, and I'm glad that a lot of companies are raising big rounds these days. And given the state of the threat actors operating, I think it's security is a must-have. It shouldn't be an afterthought, and companies, if possible, should invest for to make sure they avoid any existential risk. And for brand reputational risk management, I think early investment security is always good.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think what's interesting for those breaking into the field and targeting startups is when should they approach a startup in regards to being interested in them. If they're a 50-person startup versus a 100-person startup, what sort of skill sets might they need as they grow?
Yeah. So I think people who are new to cybersecurity and entering the field, I would say that one, uh, there is no substitute to hands-on learning, which is you need to start approaching, not be scared. The worst thing is that you might not know, and even like people I know, some people are really good at AppSec and they're skilling up in cloud security. Some people are good in cloud security and they want to upskill in AppSec, or maybe they want to upskill in compliance. So everyone in the security field is learning all the time. So which means that no one is perfect. All of us have our own learning goals at the highest level. Like I have a huge learning plan, which I hope I finish before die, I guess. So you have to constantly, that's the beauty of being in this field, that you constantly have to challenge yourself to learn and grow as a professional.
We've talked about like the individual journey. As a CISO, how do you deal with the challenges of wanting it to be secure versus business enablement and pushing the business mission? How do you have those tough conversations when someone, another business leader, might be more focused on moving fast versus moving securely?
Yeah. So I always say that these days, our function, the security function, is not just a pure risk management function. It's also a function of education and awareness, that we are educators. We uh, work with different stakeholders in the company and educate them that, hey, one, why is this needed? And two, if you do this, you'll be able to actually move faster. So it's security is not there. It's literally the proverbial brakes in a car. The brakes are not meant to slow you down. The brakes are meant so that you can go fast in a safe fashion and stop when required. So security are like these, brakes in a car. Security is a business enabler. Security is not meant to slow you down.
I love that analogy, and some people like to think that they could go fast without brakes, but they're gonna need to slow down in a safe manner to come to be able to come to a stop. But so as the organization grows, as it matures from a startup to potentially going public, what are some of the major security changes that come with that a security practitioner should be aware of?
Yeah. So when as the company matures and the going to the public journey, so uh, at least in US, I mean, we have Sarbanes-Oxley, and they have this concept of ITGC, or IT General Controls, which have huge emphasis on access controls, change in configuration management. So those come into a little bit play where you're going to be audited by a public accountant, certified public accountant, who is going to sign an attestation that you actually meet these controls, and these controls have been designed properly and they're operating effectively. So there's a lot more stringency to the level of to the controls that you established. So they're all very well documented. You need process documents which have been reviewed, approved in a timely fashion. All these controls should be operating effectively, and when these auditors come in, they'll sample from the population of changes or whatever control it is. So it's very much more stringent than when you are just operating and doing maybe one compliance standard like say SOC 2 or a PCI or a HIPAA.
You mentioned the compliance standards. What are some of the main ones that you feel organizations are going for, and what's the emphasis that might be pushing some of those standards?
Yeah. So the biggest one is customer trust that you try to it. So one is regulatory risk that if you have certain kind of data, then you have to get it. If you have electronic patient health information, you have to be HIPAA compliant. People you do business with are going to require it. That we will not sign a business associate agreement with you unless you are compliant to the HIPAA controls. Uh, but these days, the major one for customer trust is the SOC 2, which companies will use to establish to their customers that we have security controls in the domains of security, confidentiality, processing integrity, and availability, and privacy in some cases established. And we have controls against these major trust criteria. So that's the major one, at least in the US market for now. Internationally, I see ISO 27001 be more acceptable because people really don't know what SOC 2 is there.
No, definitely. I wanted to take a break for a moment and display some of the comments from our listeners because this is a live show. So we have, oops. We have David Mays saying, thank you so much for the professional insights to what makes a great security team. And then we have Jared from the FIU Apprenticeship Program saying, thank you for your insights. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for all the details that you're going into. I think oftentimes we get concerned with the day-to-day happenings, but might not know background as to how to build a security team and to go into those conversations. So now that we've kind of built up the team, we've looked at some of the compliance standards to get ready to go public or to build that customer trust. What do we do next? What are some of the first departments that you might set up? Earlier, you mentioned a couple of them, and I wanted to go in more details as to the order in which you might approach them.
Yeah. So I think companies, like if they're really lucky, maybe they'll get someone what I would call like a full stack security engineer who can do both application security and cloud security, but that's very rare. So ideally, you have maybe DevOps team handling some of the cloud security responsibilities, and maybe you want to hire your first application security engineer, and then take on these security responsibilities away from the DevOps or the infrastructure team and have a dedicated person do second line of defense controls around scanning, making sure everything from an architecture perspective, from an edge security is in place. So the GRC function, like depending on if you have regulated data, becomes very important as well. Many times I have seen people will hire consultants to help them with getting their first compliance standard. But again, you have to run it as a program, which means that you'll at some point in time you'll have to hire someone full time who has ownership and accountability of your different compliance programs, especially if you have to comply to multiple regulations. I also see that companies which are trying to do business in the EU, so there's huge privacy requirements. So I'm also seeing that depending on the company size and the customers you have, people are hiring privacy program managers early on as compared to having that functionality being performed by just one person who is handling the GRC program.
So you mentioned potentially having someone in the DevOps team and then someone in second line. Uh, this is going to be the tough question. Where should the CISO sit in the first line of defense or in the second line of defense? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think one thing is the lines of defense, I think, are not, in my at least opinion, are not very well understood. So, first line of defense are people who are actually operating the control. So, a security person doesn't deploy patches. So, the real security control is someone like, okay, we have a vulnerability and you actually patch it up. You run a script or you have automated means to do patching. So, the DevOps engineer is actually performing a security control and is the first line of defense, a person who's actually operating the control. A security engineer, a cloud security engineer, whose job is to make sure all the processes are set up to make sure that patch triage happens, patch testing happens, patches are actually getting deployed, and then having a detective control in terms of scanning. So establishing the whole pipeline of a patch intake, patch testing, patch deployment from a process perspective, automated or manual, and then a detective control if a patch has actually been deployed and if we miss something through some sort of scanning. So that's the second line of defense, that is a cloud security engineer should help establish how the first line of defense deploys the control, and then has detective controls to make sure that the control is operating effectively. So it's a collaborative work, but the first line of defense is still the person who's actually doing the job.
Okay. Okay. So it's kind of in between. You need a little bit of here and there, especially early on in the stage. I wanted to touch on some more comments. We have Sterling that's saying that great outlook. This is very insightful, great show. And then we have Mai that's saying great points on the early stage setup of the security team. Well, thank you everyone for the comments. So now that we've kind of grown the team and we've evolved, we have some first line, some second line. How do you grow from there? Do you continue to grow on first line? Do you build out like the second lines as the business grows? Like, what's your approach?
Yeah. So the one thing which I think I would like to make about the second line of defense, which again, in my opinion, is not well understood. So second line of defense doesn't mean that you are only setting policy and you're just an audit function. You are actually responsible for all the security tooling which acts as detective control. So you own the scanning, you own any detective technology, including security monitoring, that all falls under second line of defense. And many times I'll see organizations say, oh no, the CISO or the security leader, second line of defense, the only thing he or she does or they do is, setting a policy and defining what needs to be done, but they don't touch anything, which
Mhm.
I think, in my opinion, is like a flawed understanding of what second line of defense means.
Good point. Good point. David said, good point on the first line of defense can be confused with other lines of responsibility. So you mentioned that the second line's the one that does the scanning. Are they the one that does the scanning or ensure that the scanning gets done and then ensures any vulnerabilities that gets highlighted also gets remediated?
Yeah, no, they own the whole thing end to end. The control
Okay.
is that we run the scan, we triage it, and make sure that it actually gets fixed. They don't fix it themselves. That's
Okay.
the responsibility of the cloud DevOps team or the infrastructure team, but they own the whole control end to end.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I think as you grow larger, that separation then becomes a little more defined, so to say. So as we continue to grow larger, that function of running the infrastructure like IT, endpoint management, things like that, when does some of that roll off to first line and security gets less hands-on?
Yeah, no, so I think you bring actually an excellent point around, like, especially around corporate ID security. And I feel that, some of that responsibility and the maturity in the industry in particular, that some tools that, IT actually can run endpoint security by themselves, where the security team is just involved in the investigation and if something needs to be done. But the day to day, which is making sure the endpoint agent is actually deployed, a
Mhm.
machine if it needs to be wiped, those all responsibilities as lie within corporate IT. And security can be involved more in the investigation piece of it, that if we had an incident, did we have any data exfiltration, or so on.
So you bring up an interesting point of creating that incident response function. When does that get built out within a program? Like, how early on do you start to create those programs within your overall security umbrella?
So one thing is, I think security operations, under which the incident management program resides, is one of the least understood functions, that one people really don't understand that how deep it is, and it's a specialized skill set. um, so typically companies will, depending on the requirements, the approach which I see is that they'll hire some sort of managed security provider. And again, typically you'll have have seen companies which do both for the endpoint and for your production infrastructure. Or you
Mhm.
would have companies who, two separate companies, one focusing on endpoint, the MDR solutions, and one focusing on the production, which is more on the SIM side, and where you are doing log aggregation and correlation. But if you look at security operations, it's if you look the whole process, like one thing which I always say people, that incident management is actually about problem management. That you really want to go to the root cause of why this is happening, because incident are symptoms. And even things like that, how do you have a process around understanding what's bad for you? Is it like one failed login? Is it three failed logins? So having a whole program where you have the logging infrastructure well established, detection rules well defined, and a process to curate existing rules and add new ones. Because if you add, like, just keep on adding without really defining what's important to you, you'll have a deluge of alerts and you will not be able to respond to it. So it's very, very crucial, like, just having your detection governance well defined. And then you have simple processes of triage, L1, L2. And the other big thing which I don't see is that the containment and recovery piece is not very well defined. So typically for forensics, you say, hey, oh, we have a forensic firms. If we have a data incident, if we feel that something bad happened, and we can engage someone on retainer. But containment and recovery is something which is security and infrastructure or DevOps teams joint responsibility. And that thing is still, I think people are working on it from a maturity perspective, which is that what will we actually do if something happens? Do we have automated and manual run books to be able to do containment, that if an attack happens, we can actually contain the attack and we can recover from the attack? And you can't do that unless you have already thought that what bad can happen. So for example, if our password hashes are stolen, do we have a run book to reset all our user passwords, maybe even in tranches in the next 1 hour? And I can almost say that most of the companies I see haven't gone through this process. Is what can go wrong, and do we have appropriate run books from a containment and from a recovery perspective?
So potentially starting at a threat modeling point of view, doing a threat model, all of the potential things that can happen, and then creating playbooks after that.
Yeah. And the lack of the security operations functions, since it's not well understood, means that people don't get hired in that function. And since there is no visibility, and that's why I feel that a lot of companies, like, they already breached the system and don't know it,
Mhm.
because they simply don't have the infrastructure where these incidents are being monitored on an ongoing basis, with the detections clearly defined.
So something you mentioned earlier with regards to outsourcing. What's your viewpoint for early startup of outsourcing to an MSSP versus hiring someone on in full time?
So I think uh, outsourcing that particular responsibility is, I would say, is almost like a bridge towards building that capability as you grow. Because if you have a partner where they have already defined, the ingestion mechanisms, they can put in the log collectors, they already know how to parse the logs from different kind of systems that you have, and can quickly give you visibility. And even if they can give you 90% visibility into what's going on, it's better than nothing. So I think if companies can leverage partners in this space till they build that maturity within, whether they have their own full-time people who really understand the infrastructure. Because to do incident management, you really need to understand the like the ins and outs of the infrastructure. That when it comes to incident investigation, like, how do I know this is a false positive or a true positive unless I really understand what's going on?
And that becomes an interesting part when you do outsource, right? Is that they'll eventually escalate it back to you, and you're then responsible for the rest of the incident management and the containment and recovery, like you mentioned. That part seems to drop off, as you mentioned as well. Um, so another question here. So we've grown the team, and potentially at this point we have a manager, maybe a director level individual that has a couple teams underneath him. How do startups deal with maybe needing someone that has more experience at the that CISO level? Do they bring someone on part time? Do they hire consultants to finish building out the program for that maturity level for preparing for investors? What's the approaches that you've seen?
Yeah. So honestly, like, I feel that companies should, depending on how much money they have, they should hire the best available person for the job. Which means that, because when you're hiring a CISO or a security leader, what you're really hiring is experience. So I don't think that it's the title or anything. You are actually hiring a person who has been in the trenches, made those mistakes, knows how to build a security program uh, based on your own risk acceptance and based on the industry you are in. So you're actually hiring experience. And my recommendation is that if you have the money, hire the most experienced person you can, and build a team top down, which is hire a person who has been there and learned from experience. Because all of us have been in all kinds of situations. We have made tons of mistakes, so we have learned from experience. And then we can build these functions and make sure that you can get the same job done more efficiently. Because many times I'll see companies will which have a bottoms up approach, which is not bad. I mean, maybe that's the resources available to you at that point in time, and you can't hire a really senior person. But that's is that you will learn some lessons along the way in a more expensive fashion, versus bringing in someone early on who can guide you in the right direction, so you can basically achieve your business goals faster. You can get the right compliances, you can make sure there's no major incidents along the way, your architecture is well done, your backups happening, disaster recovery is in place. So that's like my personal recommendation is hire, if you're building a team, hire top down and bring the most experienced person you can based on the resources available to you.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And then, in regards to the types of skills that you're seeing are the most in demand, I know earlier you mentioned application security, cloud security. Do you see those as the biggest areas of growth for those entering the security field?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think those two are the most in demand because you're pushing code. You need someone to make sure that uh, you know uh, uh, all the code is secure. Secure code training is being given to developers. Someone who is security minded is helping them to make sure that we put the best, most secure product out there. And cloud security is like all your entire backend. So those are where I call it the rubber meets the road when it comes to security engineering, application security and cloud security, where majority of the real preventive controls are put in.
So you mentioned teaching the developers to do secure code, do you see non-technical roles that can teach that awareness, that can communicate those messages to the dev teams, potentially work in a DevOps-like environment? Someone transferring from a non-technical background into that type of role as being helpful?
No, no, absolutely. So I think one thing is every company is going to have a different development platform, different language, and even like for security professionals, when you switch jobs, you literally have to learn the security paradigm around the platform and the language that is being used, and then train the developers. So you can have definitely like have some OAS top 10 like online training, but when it gets to nitties and gritties about the security paradigm around a particular platform or language, you actually have to learn it yourself. So I think that a person who is not done even any security, if they come in a company, understand the security paradigm around the platform and language, they can actually start with that. Because literally if you study it and like for example, I think I remember like at one company we had Ruby on Rails, and I had never done Ruby on Rails security, and I printed out the Ruby on Rails security guide and read it word by word. And then I developed a program like on like how to do security on Ruby on Rails, and I had no clue how to do it before that.
Mhm.
So same thing, I think it's not that hard. And anybody like who has a technical mindset and aptitude can do it.
Okay, okay. And in regards to growing and attracting talent, what's your approach from a CISO perspective in building out that pipeline and ensuring that your talent, which is in high demand everywhere, stays with your team?
Yeah. So actually there are a lot of things which can be done to attract talent. And it starts with like a thought process. And again, you have to play the long game. And I think I always tell people like there's some companies which are looking to they identify talent and they code them. And it starts literally at that like you have people coming from traditional non-traditional backgrounds. Are there pipelines where you can take them internally and externally? So internally, like externally, like, do you have an internship program? uh, in the internship program, are you actively soliciting out people like from non-traditional backgrounds? uh, in internally, are you making giving this opportunity to other people? For example, like people are in a program management role, maybe they can do security program management. People who are in QA roles, they can do application security testing. So you have to make sure that you come across as a team which is open to ideas, open to training people, open to teaching people, open to do knowledge transfer, versus like something which is like, hey, we are security people and we don't talk to anybody and we just do some cool stuff. Versus like we are educated, and I think this educator mindset needs to be talked about more. That we are not just a risk management function, we are educators. And anybody who's willing to learn, we will do everything in our capacity to make sure that we create opportunities for them for a successful career.
Yeah, I'm a board member of a nonprofit called the whole cyberhuman initiative, and the whole point of that is to bring back the human into cyber. And like you mentioned, the educator aspect, that you really have to start with the people, understand the process before you include the technology, and the human is the foundation of all that. Um, did you have something to say?
Yeah, and again, there are like some very nifty ideas, which is organize meetups at your company, security meetups, and send those messaging out to different groups, non-traditional people coming from non-traditional background. Make sure the messaging goes out that hey, we have this meetup where we'll be teaching XYZ technology, how to do API security, mobile app security, whatever. Also, in even in your job descriptions, if there's a fight for talent. Like recently I gave this idea that you should do like a video recording where you executives are talking about security. So demonstrate externally that there is support for security at the exec level. So you can have your own team members talk in the video, which is like, what do we do? And when people relate that, hey, this is the team, these are the kind of people I'll be working with, it creates a connection where people like, if I have to choose between two companies, I would choose one which has gone the extra mile to convey that they have a culture of security, of trust, where security will be supported at the exec level.
I love that idea of having the security team share why working here is a good place, because really an interview is a two-way street, and that's a great use case. I wanted to touch on some of the comments from our listeners. David mentioned that security paradigm explains the concept perfectly in his mind, and I think for many that's a good way to describe it. But I wanted you to touch on this a little bit. How would you define the security paradigm?
Uh, so the security paradigm for me is like, the concepts are always the same. Like, if you look at authentication, authorization, confidentiality, encryption, logging, and so on. But each language and platform will have its own way to do certain stuff. One example could be even the infrastructure of the cloud platforms. That if you look at GCP and Azure,
Yeah.
the paradigm is still the same, that you want to secure it, you want to make sure it's all hardened up, it's all patched up, it has been architected well, but they just call it different things. So that's like, in my mind, is the security paradigm, that the basic principles are the same, they're applied a little bit differently, and the syntax might be different for different platforms or languages or platforms.
Okay. Okay. One of the other comments was great interview as usual. I love book recommendations. Do you have any good reads that you've been reading lately?
Book recommendations. So I think, like, I there's a one very interesting lesson I learned, like, early in my career, from one of the speakers which came to my university. And it was around that, he said that, I treat my team as my students, and I have a management book open, a technical book open, and some sort of self-help book open.
Whoops. It looks like we lost our guest, but as soon as he returns, we will bring him back on. I think what he was saying before he dropped off was that he has three types of books open: technical book, a management book, and some sort of self-help book. And I totally agree with that. I myself have several different books in my bookshelf, and one of the most recent ones was a self-help book that I recently purchased. um, Looked like we got him back on the stream. So you just finished mention that there's three types of books: management, technical, and self-help. Was there any specific one that you wanted to recommend?
Specific one, I think I like reading company specific books. So for example, I think, read, recently, the Everything Store, and then I read the work rules from Google. And
Mhm.
uh, get to have a picture of like how management philosophies at each of these companies developed. And I think there's one which came from Netflix, which is like in my reading queue very recently, around Netflix, which I plan to read shortly. So I think those are the ones which intrigued me. Is that, each of these companies are very different from the way they have evolved from a management philosophy perspective. So when it comes to management, I think, those are some of the things which I've read recently, which is company specific books which talk about the evolution of a company, that they were in a specific industry or business domain, but how they came together as a team, and how, because literally, like, the way they interview people, the way they define their own objectives and goals, how they execute, there is a very different management philosophy. And some of these books, give some window into those philosophies, and which is very fascinating.
Absolutely, totally agree. Another one of the questions is regarding cloud platforms. If there's one that moving towards that path, is there one that's bigger or that you would target, or why would you go with one cloud platform over another?
No, so actually, one is like I'm like platform agnostic, but typically, and again, this is well known that typically startups will are fairly inclined towards maybe go towards AWS, and larger enterprise are more geared towards Azure platform, and with some companies choosing GCP in the enterprise. So I would say that if you're targeting like startups, maybe AWS might be a better target initially, and then if you're targeting large enterprise and move into Azure and GCP.
Okay. One of the recent evolutions that I've seen from GCP was that they had the ability to segregate out very sensitive compute type environments all within the same space so that you could have very sensitive government like communication within the same cloud tenant, their regular compute to make communication between the organization itself both secure as well as being able to speak to all the employees. Have you worked in any of those environments before?
Yeah, so I think Google has done a great job, like down to the chip level, even the way they design their chips, and they have this, even the keys are broken up. So it's a very nifty way of how do you make sure confidentiality in a shared infrastructure environment, and they have put a lot of thought process. But I would say it's not just
Looks like
GCP.
we Oh, go ahead. Sorry, we
It's not
got
just
a
GCP. I
lecture.
think the other cloud platforms have done an equally great job. Like I think I've seen the evolution of key and secrets management in AWS. How it's it was initially they had these Luna appliances, and then they brought it. They had the cloud HSM, and then they had their own hardware now, dedicated HSMs, and so on. So I think each of the platforms have gone through a journey where they have put a lot of thought process around key management, secrets management, confidentiality, and how they handle encryption in general.
Wow, we've gone through such a journey from the inception of a startup to growing to a very mature stage and talking about the different cloud platforms. Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
So I think one thing which you recently started was around like coaching, and I do have some ideas and thought process around that. So when I think of a mentor, is like you find someone whom you really respect and you go for advice, and if you have any issues, that someone who you use as sounding board. But I think when I word use coach or coaching, is for me it's almost like a job that I am training you for success, which is that I've been there, done that. I know how to make sure that you basically achieve the objective goal. So it's more rigid, it's more stringent. You are basically also holding the person accountable, that you got to practice, you need to do all these stuff. So this is where I think people have started to look for mentors, and I would say that people should start looking for coaches where they coach them for success. And I think having it like a formal relationship where like you get into some sort of arrangement with someone you identify as a coach, so it's a win-win situation on both sides. And I'm glad that what you're doing in terms of establishing like people who really need help enter the cyber domain.
Yeah,
um,
I think with regards to using the word coach, there's multiple different definitions, right? There's teacher that takes public information and relays it. There's a mentor that kind of combines that public information with their own experiences and relays it. And then there's a coach. They might not necessarily be an expert in all the areas, but they work with their clients to help them overcome obstacles, develop milestones, and train them along the way. So I think what you're mentioning is kind of between a mentor and a teacher, and I definitely think that that's very helpful with regards to startups, because when maybe an advisor would be a great term for that, is that if you've worked through multiple startups, you can really help advise them on the best ways to go forward. And ultimately, it's still up to that business owner to make that decision.
Yeah. And I think this is just like my general advice to anyone who is listening, is that if I reflect back, that what I could have done better is that I think we just need to start talking to more people. So many times people are a little bit like apprehensive about reaching out to other people. And I say the worst thing, that someone will not have time for you, but reach out to as many people as you can. Talk to as many as people as you can. And many people, like, they are givers, and they'll give you the gift of their time and their knowledge and their experience. And second thing I would say, that don't, especially if you are starting new,
Mm-hmm.
build, try to join a community, build a community of fellow professionals who are trying to do the same thing. So you don't have to be do this by yourself, because then you're like, hey, I tried to do it, I didn't succeed, and I ran into a roadblock. So it's easy to get demotivated. But if you become part of a community, or you build a community around these goals, that who are other people who are trying to do the same thing, can we get together and build an environment where we learn together and we succeed. That's something would be really helpful. You don't have to do it alone.
Yeah, speaking of kind of building that community, I actually have a great use case of that. InfoSec Live, which gave us a wave a little bit earlier, Simon Lindstedt, that kind of set up this community. He was coming into the field just brand new and wanted to create a community for other individuals to kind of have that shared space. And while many of them might have joined from LinkedIn and other communities, here you have the shared space of many going through the same journey. So definitely recommend it as well. And someone else said nailed it with regards to what you were saying earlier. So thank you so much. Truly appreciate it. If someone wants to follow up with you, where are the best places to follow up with you?
So LinkedIn is the best place. I'm fairly active on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me, shoot me a message, and I'll try to help in the best way possible I can.
Okay. I'll make sure to add your LinkedIn profile to the comments as well as to the show notes. And I really want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Same here. Thank you for the invite, Chris. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Take care.